Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you to Dr. Topping for the invitation and for the introduction. I did grow up in Calgary, so it's always good to be back in Alberta. I was actually in Calgary yesterday and drove up today. It's nice to be introduced as a local, or actually something of a local, in Edmonton. Shows a certain fraternity between the cities that doesn't always exist. I didn't realize that this, I actually am a big football fan. I follow football, but I didn't actually realize the Grey Cup, when I agreed to this, was this weekend here in Edmonton. I won't be here for it. I'll be back in Calgary tomorrow, but anyway, Calgary didn't do too well the last two times, so hopefully back in Alberta might be better for our Stampeders. It was nice to hear the introduction related to Dr. Mousseau. Sounds like an impressive man, and I think it's good to have a surgeon who begins his operations with a prayer. And we'll do the same this evening. We're in a church, so we should at least start with a prayer. We'll see how the talk ends up, but we start with a prayer. At least we're on the right track. So, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and thou shalt renew the face of the earth. Let us pray, O God, who did enlighten the hearts, did instruct the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Spirit. Grant that by the same Spirit they may be ever wise and rejoice in your consolation through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. St. Thomas More, pray for us. Dr. Topping invited me some years ago to give a talk in Fredericton when he was at the University of St. Thomas, not Thomas More. Got to meet his family there, and so it's nice to see him again. And I was saying at dinner with him that his career has been affiliated with St. Thomas More in different places in Saskatoon and in the United States, and so I'm actually a St. John Fisher man, if you must know, but I have a good esteem for Thomas More. He's the more famous of the two. He went to Oxford. Oxford has better public relations than Cambridge, which is where I went, and St. John Fisher was a Cambridge man. So I do my part to promote St. John Fisher. We have a dinner in Kingston every year. We call it the St. John Fisher dinner. But the two of them together obviously are great inspirations, and it's nice to have the statue here for our talk this evening. I should let you know, a lot of the seminarians are here. Your rector, Father Stephen Hero, and I were in the seminary together, lived across the hall from each other for about 3 years, I think. So it's good to be with Father Stephen, and if you have desire to know things about how he used to be when he was a seminarian, I have nothing to say, because he was as mature and respectable then as he is now. He did not appear to have a young rebellious phase. If you want to know more about me when I was there, ask him. I'm sure he'll. The topic tonight is Truth and Evangelization, 25 years after Veritatis Splendor. And my subject then is Veritatis Splendor, the most comprehensive treatment of Catholic ethics. Usually we use the word ethics to mean philosophy, and morality or moral theology to mean theology, but this is an ethics lecture. And in the 25th anniversary year of Veritatis Splendor, it's worth paying attention to this landmark encyclical of 1993. The question of truth and falsehood is there right from the beginning of the sacred scriptures. In Genesis, the serpent appears at the very beginning, in those early chapters, the one who's described in St. John's Gospel as the liar and the father of lies. In the beginning of the letter to the Romans, St. Paul summarizes in Romans 1 the great cosmic battle between good and evil. He says that immorality, in a particular way carnal immorality, is the consequence of exchanging the truth of God for a lie. So the question of truth and falsehood is there right from the beginning of the sacred scriptures. Veritatis Splendor deals precisely with the truth. Splendor of the Truth is the title, but in a particular regard to morality. In 107 of Veritatis Splendor, as towards the end of it, we read that evangelization in general, and therefore the new evangelization, John Paul writes, also involves the proclamation and presentation of morality. Jesus, when he preached the kingdom of God and its saving love, called people to faith and conversion. And John Paul also notes that the apostles, when they preached a way, not just a person who was the truth, but a way. And in fact, as you know, in the early days, Christians spoke about themselves as followers of the way. That is to say, they had a way of living, not just a set of truths that they believed, but actually a way of living. And so John Paul says in Veritatis Splendor that evangelization includes the proclamation of this way. Now, when Dr. Topping asked me to give this lecture, aside from the anniversary, I wanted to speak on Veritatis Splendor, is because I think today, that is 2018, we need to capture, remember, re-emphasize the centrality of morality in the way that we propose as part of evangelization. Because, in fact, in recent years, Veritatis Splendor itself and the vision which it represents is in danger of being set aside. So therefore, especially talking to seminarians who are obviously preparing, God willing, for a life as pastors, and of course, Newman Theological College, formation of students of theology, I think it's a matter of some urgency or importance, maybe to say better, to recall the teaching of Veritatis Splendor, and I'll try and make a case for that this evening. The status of Veritatis Splendor, which I'm going to say a few words describing it in a few minutes, but today is a bit contested. Now, how important is this encyclical from 1993? We see, for example, in Amoris Laetitia, which is the Holy Father's exhortation on marriage and family questions after the two synods in 2014 and 2015, a very long document, longest document in the history of the papacy, 60,000 words. I think the second longest in the history of the papacy was Pastoris Dabo Vobis, and third was Evangelii Gaudium. So our age is blessed with documents of great length. But anyway, in the 60,000 words of Amoris Laetitia and the almost 400 footnotes, Veritatis Splendor is not mentioned, which is really an astonishing achievement to speak on that subject at length and to have almost 400 citations. You can only do that by deliberately not mentioning it. So that decision was taken not to mention Veritatis Splendor. And the reason for that is because it's very difficult to read Amoris Laetitia in continuity with Veritatis Splendor. It's not entirely impossible, but it's difficult. And you'll recall that after Amoris Laetitia was promulgated, the cardinals who put forward the questions, the so-called dubia, the questions, they were really, exception of one, they were about Veritatis Splendor. So the questions were, how do you read Veritatis Splendor in continuity, or rather Amoris Laetitia in continuity with Veritatis Splendor? And as is well known, those questions were not answered. The answer was implied in the document itself when it was not cited, but the answers were not given. And in 2017, so about a year ago, maybe 15 months ago now, for example, to show this is a live issue, Joseph Seaford, some of you may know Joseph Seaford, he's a very distinguished Catholic philosopher. He founded the International Academy of Philosophy. He was a friend of John Paul II's, and that academy is now in Granada, Spain. And even though he's the founder of the academy, he was fired last year by the Archbishop of Granada after he wrote an article at the end of it. I mean, not the end, but he's had a multi-decade, very distinguished career, after writing an essay in which he said, or that the teaching of Veritatis Splendor and the teaching of Remorse Laetitia, in his view, were not easily reconciled, and in fact were not reconcilable. So he made a very bold claim, and he was fired for that from an Institute Academy of Philosophy, which he was the founder of. Which is the point to say that it's a live issue. This is not a issue of just academic interest. Theology is never just about academic interest, but that this is actually something that the pastors of the church and leading thinkers in the church are trying to deal with. So it's a very live issue. So a word about Veritatis Splendor in the context. Where did it come from? So it was published on the 6th of August, or it was dated the 6th of August, Transfiguration, 1993. It came out, was published, I think, October of that year. And it deals with basically the relationship between truth and freedom and truth and conscience in the moral act. Now, what's the background? Well, you can look backwards. It came out 25 years, almost exactly, after Humanae Vitae, and 15 years to the date, the official date, the death of Pope Paul VI, now St. Paul VI, who died on the 6th of August, 1978. It's a little bit hard to appreciate, if you were born afterwards, what the late 70s were like. But they were a time of a great unraveling, it felt, in the world. Italy itself was besieged by terrorist attacks. The Holy Father's good friend, the former Prime Minister of Italy, was murdered in May of 1978. There were terrorist attacks in many different parts of Europe, economic dislocation. It was a time of turmoil in the world, and it was a time of turmoil in the church. St. Paul VI was elected in June of 1963. And he celebrated his anniversary then of his election every year on the Feast of Peter and Paul. So every year, obviously the Pope celebrates that feast day, Peter and Paul, patron saints of Rome, but he would use it more often than not as a way of reflecting on what had gone on in his pontificate. And the 1978 Peter and Paul address, which is 6 weeks before he died, and he knew I don't know if he knew he was going to die in 6 weeks, but he knew he was coming to the end. And it was his last major public address. And it's a remarkable homily to go back and read 1978 Peter and Paul, because Pope Paul VI reviews his pontificate, different aspects of it, and he says he's greatly suffered, and he laments that the church is subject to a lot of turmoil. And he speaks about Humanae Vitae, which was 10 years before that, 1968. We marked the 50th anniversary of that this summer. And he says, very bluntly, I paid a tremendous price. I suffered for my teaching. And we're not used to actually Pope speaking that way. And 40 years ago, it was even a little bit more unusual to speak in that personal way. But he said, frankly, in that homily, just before he died, 6 weeks before he died, and I suffered for this. And then he makes this kind of boast, not a prideful boast, but even a humble boast, you might say, and almost lament, where he says, but I have not betrayed the truth. Right? So he comes to the end of his life, and it'd be hard for us to imagine that. Somebody getting up at the end of his life. Imagine your pastor after 40 years retiring, or a bishop after 20 years, and he says, I've not betrayed the truth. Right? So that was very heavy on his heart, that he saw the truth all around him being disregarded. He saw his teachings being ignored, but he said, I can say, like St. Paul at the end of his life, I've kept the faith. He said, I've not betrayed the truth. So that's the ambiance, the ethos that John Paul had around him in 1978 when he was elected. And so he began to try and repair that, the years which the locust had eaten. He's trying to repair that. And he does various things, Familiaris Consortio. He's teaching on the family, theology of the body, specifically to address some of the turmoil after Humanae Vitae and the discussions and widespread dissent from the church's teaching on marriage and family issues. But what John Paul recognized was that this particular set of controversies had a wider impact on the whole of the church's teaching, her capacity to teach about these matters, how she could formulate that teaching, how one could receive it, the role of conscience, whether this teaching was liberating, all these sorts of questions. So in 1987, he decided that he was going to write an encyclical that would deal not with a specific moral question. There had been those before. That wasn't that unusual. There's a particular controversy. The Pope writes an encyclical to treat that controversy, but rather an encyclical that was going to address how the church would teach, the foundations of the church's teaching. So not a specific issue, but basically how one went about moral theology. Now, that encyclical was announced in August of 1987, and it came out in October of 1993. So it took 6 years to work on, and it wasn't because Pope John Paul II or the chief officer in charge of this project, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, were either lacking in industriousness or intelligence. So this was a massive project that not only took their energies, but involved a very widespread consultation around the world, because they were trying to do something quite unusual, as to address the basic foundations of how we think about morality. Genuine understanding and compassion, this is John Paul, Veritatis Splendor 95, must mean love for the person, for his true good, for his authentic freedom. And this does not result certainly from concealing or weakening moral truth, but rather proposing it in its most profound meaning. Veritatis Splendor 95. John Paul is basically saying there that we need to propose moral truth, not just the moral truth about a specific thing, but the whole of the moral truth in its most profound understanding. So it's possible, if you want to look at a kind of an arc from 1968, Humanae Vitae and everything that followed that, to 1978, Pope Paul VI at the end of his life insists that he's not betrayed the truth, but sees that the truth is being largely contested. To 15 years after that, 1993, Veritatis Splendor, on the presentation of the necessity of moral truth for authentic human freedom. And in fact, towards the end of Veritatis Splendor, number 80, John Paul actually goes back to Humanae Vitae itself and quotes Pope Paul VI that it's never lawful, even for the gravest reasons, to do evil that good may come of it. One of the controversies you want to address. So what might we summarize is at the heart of Veritatis Splendor? It's a very substantial document. You could make different arguments as to what's at the heart of it. I'm going to highlight one or two things only tonight. One might be, as characterized by Archbishop Charles Chaput last year, there's an essay on First Things, I think October of 2017. It's readily available. He argued that what Veritatis Splendor was trying to overcome was legalism in Catholic moral theology. You might say a move away from legalism to love. And Archbishop Chaput's argument is basically that there's an older kind of legalism that everybody's familiar with, which is basically that the great Catholic question of morality is, Father, how far can I? So how far can I before it's a sin? How close to communion can I eat before I can go to communion? How much can I eat before I violate their fasting? How far can I go with my girlfriend before it's a sin? How little can I pay my employees before it's a sin? So that sort of idea is that you're looking to maximal indulgence without falling into sin. That's kind of the old sort of legalism. Archbishop Chaput's argument is that there's another kind of legalism that took development in the late 60s, early 70s, which was also legalism, but saying, okay, you've got to obey the rule. How can we make the rule seem less onerous? How can we make the rule seem narrower? How can we make the exceptions to the rule, or how can we multiply exceptions to the rule? But basically, that both approaches, he calls a more rigorous approach or a more lax approach, we're focused on that morality is a matter of rules. So you have rules, and you either observe them grudgingly, so to get up to the margin without transgressing it, or you find a way around them. But at the heart of morality are rules. What John Paul tries to do in Veritatis Splendor is say that Christian morality is not a matter of following the rules. The rules are a consequence of our relationship with the Lord Jesus. And to get away from that rules-based idea in either direction, he points out. Right? For example, the same argument has been made by Pope Benedict and Pope Francis, but Pope Benedict, from the opening words of Deus Caritas Est, 2005, being Christian is not the result of an ethical choice. So being Christian is not the result of a system of morality or following ethics, Benedict XVI. But the encounter with an event, a person which gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction. So to put things in proper order, that the rules follow from. If you want to think about it in the context of a family, if you said, what's it like to be married? What's it like to be in a family? You said, well, it means I have to be home at a certain time for dinner. That's a family rule. And maybe that rule sometimes can seem burdensome. But something would be wrong if that would seem to be the sum, or if that was it. You just have to be home at a certain time. Right? It's missing the point of what the rule is in service of that relationship. When I teach students at Queen's University, I often use the phrase to help them remember this point that the church does not teach that something is wrong, or rather the church rather does teach that something is wrong because there's something wrong with it. It's not that something is wrong because the church says so. Now there are some exceptions to that, but in general, if the church says something is wrong, it's because there's something wrong with it. There's something in it, self, that's wrong. It's not wrong because the church says so. Right? And so you're invited to think about what is that thing, the act, and who is the one that's doing it, the actor. And so this move away from legalism is what, in one analysis, John Paul is trying to accomplish in Veritatis Splendor. I think that's a valid way of thinking about the heart of Veritatis Splendor. That's very important today in terms of evangelization, to understand that way of thinking, because for most people, in their common conception of things, they think of religion principally as morality, a way of behaving. If you were to go out on the street and say, what does it mean to be a Christian? Most people would not answer, it means to believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, or it means to have a relationship with Jesus Christ. They would say, well, a Christian does this or doesn't do this. And they might be largely true, it might even be complimentary. A Christian ought to be charitable, a Christian ought to be kind, a Christian ought to be merciful. Right? Or it might be Christians ought not to. A Christian ought not to be a liar or defrauder. Or maybe a contested point of morality, often sexual morality or life morality. Christians are against that. All of which could be true, but it's very incomplete. But that's the mindset that we often confront, is that Christianity, or religion in general, is about morality, and within morality, largely about questions of sexuality and life issues. And so that's the world that we're arguing or in conversation with, and we have to sort of shift that. But that's actually not what the Christian faith proposes, is that we follow a set of rules. The Christian faith proposes a relationship that teaches us, reveals to us the truth about the world, the truth about creation, the truth about God, the truth about ourselves, and from that certain rules, codes of behavior follow. So that's important from an evangelical point of view, to understand that mindset and to understand the counter-proposal or the authentic proposal that the Christian faith makes. I just saw that you were, just before the lecture, you were handed out this article that Dr. Topping wrote. I presume that was for those who might find the actual lecture to be a bit dull or uninteresting, that you'd have some alternative reading to get through. Very kind, good thinking. I've actually read it before, so you'll excuse me for not reading it now, but it's a nice article. And Ryan is here making a point about 3 anniversaries, one of which I've already mentioned, 2 of which, Veritatis Splendor 25 years ago and Humanae Vitae 1968, 50 years ago. And he mentions another one in 1998, Fides et Ratio, and the relationship between faith and reason. We had a short email exchange, we will talk about tomorrow. And I said that actually, if you're talking about anniversaries, John Paul anniversaries that are important, I think another one from 1998 was the Holy Father's letter on the Lord's Day, Dies Domini. Actually, the more I think about it, and the more pastoral work I do with young people, I think it's actually more important than the other ones. Because that's a perfect example, rather, if we're going to build a Catholic culture, this is a whole different subject, so I'll just say that we have to build it around something, and we're going to build it around something, we might as well build it around what the Lord gave us, which is a liturgical way of thinking, at the heart of which is the Sabbath. That's a whole other lecture, which I'm happy to give. Maybe later. But that's a perfect example of how do we live the Lord's Day, right? In general, we live it very poorly, right? Our culture doesn't have a sense of the Sabbath anymore, but even in the household of faith, do we approach the Sabbath as a kind of a legal obligation, or do we see it as a gift to be embraced? Right? And if you think of all the controversies, I think it's the most disputed question in the Gospels is the Sabbath. It's often a dispute between a legalistic interpretation of the Sabbath and the idea of living the Sabbath as a gift. Right? I grew up in Calgary. In Calgary, when I was growing up there in the 1970s and 80s, the Saturday anticipated Mass, almost by divine decree, was always at 5 p.m. or earlier, because it had to finish, absolutely had to finish by, say, 10 to 6, so you could get home in time for Hockey Night in Canada, which is at 6 p.m., right? That was in the days before the internet. You couldn't be streaming later, no on-demand, so when it started at 6 p.m., you had to be home. I now live in the Eastern Time Zone. Hockey Night in Canada starts at 8, so you can have Mass anytime you want. 5:30, 7:15, 6:45, right? So that's living the Lord's Day, at least in the Diocese of Calgary back in the 70s. It's no different, right? So the whole idea, and remember, the Lord's Day is where? It's the 3rd commandment, right? It's more important than thou shalt not kill. It's more important than thou shalt not kill, the Sabbath. So that's an example of that moving from legalism to love. There are other ways of looking at Veritatis Splendor, but I'll just summarize its key teaching. You can do a whole course on it, so this will be very brief. But basically the idea of Veritatis Splendor is that there's a truth about things. That things have a nature, we would say, so you can know the truth about them, right? So there's a truth about water, right? If this was very cold, it would be ice. I couldn't drink it. If it was very hot, it would be steam. So there's a truth about things. So there's a truth about things, including myself as a human being, human person. There's a truth about me, and there's a truth about acts. So the acts that I do, there's a truth about them. They have a nature. And basically, some acts, the nature of the act is incompatible with my nature as a human being. Right? So there are certain things that are contrary to my nature. And that's why I shouldn't do them. And that's why the Church teaches against them. And that's why divine revelation prohibits them. So, for example, lying. Language has a nature. Human society has a nature. And if our capacity to communicate, if our capacity as language animals, which distinguishes us, is used for falsehood, that damages, it violates the nature of what communication is for. It also violates or damages the common good that language communication serves. That's why God reveals to us, thou shalt not bear false witness. That's why the church teaches us that it's sinful to lie. So that's an example, that it's the nature of the thing and the nature of the person. For those of you who have had an introduction to some of these concepts, you'll recognize that nature appears here. That's where we get the idea of natural law. Natural law is not the law of nature, the law of the jungle. What's the law of nature? The law of nature is that when the lions come, the zebras leave the elderly, the crippled, and the babies to be eaten. That's the law of nature. But human beings don't do that. We don't leave the elderly and the crippled and the babies to be devoured when we're under attack. Right? At least we shouldn't, and usually we don't. Right? Because the human nature, the law of our nature, says that the weak are owed a special protection. So that's what we're talking about. Now, there are some specific counter ways of thinking that John Paul here is arguing against. I'm not going to get into that. That's a bit more technical. But just for those who are studying in this field, there are three systems of thinking that he says are not compatible with Catholic moral teaching. One of them is proportionalism, which basically says that the nature of the act itself may be incompatible with my nature, but in proportion to other things, it may be justifiable. Another theory is called consequentialism, which is that the consequence might be better or might justify what might otherwise be sinful. John Paul already quoted Paul VI on that. And the third one is called fundamental option, which is that my basic disposition towards the Lord is fundamental and my particular acts do not determine what we would call a state of grace. Those are theories that are being rejected. I'm not going to say anything more about those specific things because that's a little bit more technical of an argument. Another way to look at what Veritatis Splendor, so what's the heart of Veritatis Splendor, is the question of freedom. We see this in Veritatis Splendor 31. The human issues most frequently debated and differently resolved in contemporary moral reflection, John Paul writes, are all closely related, albeit in various ways, to a crucial issue, human freedom. So basically, Veritatis Splendor says, okay, what is the relationship between truth and freedom? Truth and conscience, conscience and freedom. It takes these things up. So John Paul, in many ways, I think is best understood as a pope of freedom. That is to say that what preoccupied him as a moral philosopher and what animated him as a pastor was the question of freedom. It's not entirely surprising, given that he spent his entire adult life from the age of 18 to 58 living under systems which systematically denied human freedom. So today, I think we have, from an evangelical point of view, something powerful to propose and to discuss. Perhaps, I'm going to say why it might not be as optimistic a situation as I suggest at first, because the culture around us loves its freedom. Right? We're a culture that's very sensitive to freedom, which prizes its freedom. And this can propose a kind of discussion, is what exactly is this freedom? And there are basically two different approaches to freedom. One is that a freedom that emphasizes the capacity to choose, but is indifferent to the ends being chosen. So that what's important is that I can choose, that I can make a choice, that I can exercise my will, but What's very much secondary, if not indifferent, a matter of indifference, is what is being chosen. You might call this a freedom of indifference, where the capacity to choose alone is what's important and the ends are secondary or a matter of indifference. That's a very widespread way of thinking. But opposed to that is a different idea of freedom, which is that the freedom is the capacity to choose in accord with some good, to progress, to become expert, to master, to achieve some good. You might call it a freedom for excellence. There's different ways. Freedom of indifference, where the capacity to choose is important, and a freedom for something, for excellence. So think of an example. Think about playing a piano. Right? So anybody can sit down at a piano and just hit any keys that he wants to hit. He's exercising a certain, expressing his will. He's not being constrained. You're not saying that there's a certain way you have to do it. And he has a certain freedom. There's a certain freedom in that. Right? He can just hit whatever key he wants, and there's a certain expression. And if he's indifferent to the sound that's made by the piano, then there is a certain freedom that's there. Certainly, learning how to play the piano, as we customly call it, with all of its drills and exercises and scales and so forth, is much more burdensome than just sitting down and hitting whatever key you want. But the person who has a freedom only of indifference does not have the capacity to play a piece that would be pleasing to hear. He just has the capacity to make the thing make noise. If you think of the discipline, the rules, the nature of the piano has a nature. If you play certain keys together, they make a pleasing chord. If you play other keys together, they don't. That's the nature of the instrument. And there's a certain nature in the person playing. You know, we have a certain number of fingers and sort of capacity. We can only hit a certain number of things at a time. So freedom of indifference, freedom of excellence. And both are very widespread in our society today. Right? On certain subjects, especially things to do with marriage, family, sexuality, life, and so forth, you might say that the prevalent opinion seems to be a freedom of indifference, that the capacity to choose is what's emphasized rather than the thing being chosen. You see that especially in the debate over abortion, where someone emphasizes it being pro-choice without reference to the thing being chosen, usually. But there's also other aspects of our culture which are very much freedom for excellence. Right? All those parents who drive their kids to hockey arenas at 6 a.m. in the morning. Right? That's not, no one's indifferent to that. No one enjoys it. Right? If you tell your children that you enjoy taking them to the hockey arena at 6 a.m., you are not living in the splendor of the truth. Because no one does. But people do it. Why? Because there's some good, right, that is prized, right? In fact, in that case, it's not maybe a good example because the freedom of the child is totally obliterated as he's dragged out of bed at 5 in the morning to go play hockey. Veritatis Splendor 13 quotes St. Augustine. This is St. Augustine. The beginning of freedom is to be free from crimes, such as murder, fornication, theft, fraud, sacrilege, and so forth. When one becomes free of these crimes, and every Christian should be without them, one begins to lift up one's head toward freedom. This is only the beginning of freedom, not perfect freedom. So there's St. Augustine very specifically saying that the freedom to choose, including even wicked things, is not a freedom at all. And of course, St. Augustine here is building on St. Paul, who all his letters are built on this idea between the freedom of the sons of God versus the slavery to sin. I think, what kind of slavery? If I'm doing what I'm choosing, how am I a slave? Well, because Paul says you're not pursuing a freedom for excellence, in this case, excellence in the moral life. So we have these competing visions of freedom. Veritatis Splendor says the truth about things, the truth about acts, and the truth about man means that we are made for a freedom for excellence. And in a culture which prizes freedom, this perhaps allows us a proposal to make. What are you using your freedom for? In a few minutes, I'll say something about why maybe things are not. That path might be closed off. The biblical image which John Paul uses for the first third of, or the part one, I should say, of three, of Veritatis Splendor is the rich young man. The man who has a desire for eternal life, who knows that somehow or the other Jesus has something to say about that, who comes to him and say, what good must I do for eternal life? He sees the link between how he acts and the most important thing, eternal life. Jesus tells him, if he wants eternal life, keep the commandments, and he specifies the lesser commandments, the ones dealing with neighbor and not with God. It seems to be sufficient for eternal life. The man says, I'm already doing that, and Jesus proposes, okay, there's something more that you could have. Because the purpose of the law is not just to keep you from damnation, but to orient you towards God. So, detach yourself from your worldly goods, come follow me. And the young man can't do that or won't do that and goes away sad. And Jesus then clarifies that it's very difficult to do this. In fact, for man it's impossible, but for God all things are possible. There's a reference somewhere in the introduction to St. Thomas Aquinas, so let me say something about St. Thomas, because I hate for my host to go home crestfallen. But in St. Thomas's vision, he lays out the treatise on law. I think it's questions in the 90s, if I remember correctly, the treatise on law. And he deals with all the different kinds of law. And at the end of it, he finishes the treatise on law, and the next is the treatise on grace. Because what St. Thomas says is that even though the law we can know, and therefore if we know it, we should be able to do it, but in fact, in our fallen state, we can't. Or if you want to make a more modest claim, at least we don't. And therefore, we need grace. Right? So this is the same dynamic that's being worked out with the rich young man. John Paul comments in Veritatis Splendor 8, the question which the rich young man puts to the Jesus of Nazareth is one which rises from the depths of his heart. It is an essential and unavoidable question for the life of every man, for it is about the moral good and the fulfillment of his own destiny. Now, this is where I will be a little less bullish on the evangelical possibilities, because I think that's an interesting question to ask. Is it, in fact, a question that every man asks is unavoidable? Maybe he should, but is that question about eternal life, about what good must I do, is that unavoidable? The evidence seems to be that many people, perhaps even most, have a very easy time avoiding it. They just live on a surface level and never touch those questions. It's not so much they disagree, but they're just not interested. Occasionally I encounter people and I wonder if they're capable of salvation, not because God's grace is insufficient, but because it never occurs to them anything more than just the immediacy. So it's not that they're against it or they've chosen against God, it's just that they live in a way that's easier to do in our technological age, that's very distracted, very shallow. So Veritatis Splendor, built around the encounter with the rich young man, presupposes, in a way, that these questions are there in every human heart. And I suppose in a certain sense they are, but they can be quite easily masked or set aside. And so as an evangelical challenge, it might be that you could say to somebody in one way or the other, what are you living for? What great cause are you committed to? And the answer would be, well, I'm not really interested in that. So we live in our culture has tendencies in both directions. Talk about the splendor of truth, and we say we find areas of the culture where truth is readily denied, that it even exists. But in other areas of the culture, the objective nature of truth is not only professed but widely insisted upon. So in certain ecological debates, right, say take climate change, those who have a dissenting view from the main consensus are called deniers. Right? So if you're denying, it's not because you have a different view, it's because there is a truth and you're denying it. So that dynamic of objective truth exists in some parts of our culture. Truth claims are often made in terms of progressive causes. If you want a very interesting treatment of this, look at Benedict XVI's address at the German Bundestag, the federal parliament, in September of 2011, when he said, if there's an order in the environment, if there's an ecological truth that has to be respected, shouldn't there also be some truths about the human person that should be respected? He's making that analogy there. And this is where we find this a bit of a incoherence that can also find its way into the life of the church, which is that in our culture as a whole, truth claims, even very rigorously enforced truth claims, can be made in certain areas, but in the area of sexual morality especially, then you have a different set of rules that apply. And one of the interesting questions for the work of moral theology in the church is, do we apply different rules to questions of sexual morality, marriage, family, life, etc., than we do to other things? So to make a very practical observation, which goes to that initial question, I said Veritatis Splendor is a very live issue, especially in light of Amoris Laetitia. The description of how conscience can work in Amoris Laetitia in terms of very specific question about couples living conjugal life who are not validly married seems to be a set of rules or an approach to conscience that only applies to that situation, because no one's ever proposed that it would work in other areas of life. Like, for example, if you were running a business which defrauded its workers consistently of their wages, and you said, well, I know I shouldn't do it, I don't really want to do it, but I'm kind of stuck because I kind of got into it and it'd be hard to get out of it without, maybe the business wouldn't survive, maybe whatever, maybe people are depending on me, so even though I know it's wrong and I love the truth about treating workers honestly, I'm still going to defraud them of their wages. No one even tries to make that argument. But that's the argument that we see in the field of sexual morality often comes up. So this question of the culture and influencing the church sometimes creates different categories. So we have these competing tendencies. But when we find that there's a special set of rules for one aspect of the moral life that don't apply elsewhere, I think we know where there's a problem to be addressed. I would say also that in Veritatis Splendor we have a approach to the moral life which touches a bit more broadly, I would say, on pastoral theology. So not strictly speaking moral theology, but pastoral theology. That is, how do we care for souls? And The last part of Veritatis Splendor, part 3, is called Lest the Cross of Christ be emptied of its power. And John Paul puts the moral life against the background of the martyrs. If I can find the quotation here. Number 93. Although martyrdom represents the high point of witness to moral truth, and one to which relatively few people are called, there is nonetheless a consistent witness which all Christians must daily be ready to make, even at the cost of suffering, and grave sacrifice. Indeed, faced with the many difficulties which fidelity to the moral order can demand, even in the most ordinary circumstances, the Christian is called, with the grace of God, to a sometimes heroic commitment. The Church's teaching, number 95, and in particular her firmness in defending the universal and permanent validity of the precepts prohibiting intrinsically evil acts, is not infrequently seen as a sign of intolerable intransigence, particularly with regard to the enormously complex and conflict-filled situations present in the moral life of individuals in society today. This intransigence is said to be in contrast with the Church's motherhood. In fact, genuine understanding and compassion must mean love for the person, for his true good, for his authentic freedom. John Paul says, look, I'm very well aware that the Church's insistence on certain moral principles can be seen as onerous, even oppressive. But he says, if it corresponds to the truth of the person, it's not. And the example of the martyrs teach us that it's possible with God's grace. Now, this is a pastoral vision that is very challenging because it says that I'm not proposing to you something that is going to make your life comfortable, but I'm telling you that you're capable of a heroism, even to the extent of martyrdom. So this is not a specific moral theological point, but it's a pastoral theological point, which is at the heart of the vision of Veritatis Splendor. And that pastoral vision is not the only one. You can have different pastoral visions, and at the moment we do have a different pastoral vision, which challenges the pastoral theology of Veritatis Splendor, not just the moral theology. At World Youth Day in Krakow in 2016, a couple who had grown up with the young Father Wojtyła, and then Lady Bishop and Cardinal Wojtyła Piotr and Teresa Molenski, they gave a presentation on the lifelong friendship they had with the young priest. He accompanied them on they're part of the kayak group, the Środowisko. He spoke to them about their young lives. He married them. He baptized all their children. They used to be visitors every summer to Castel Gandolfo. So they knew him this whole life. And it was very interesting in this long life that they had known him. The only thing that they quoted from hundreds of hours with him and all his documents and so forth was that when he told them repeatedly, and they quoted it in an address he gave to the youth of Poland, first at Częstochowa in 1983, and then again in Westerplatte, which in 1987. And it was a version of this that he told them, but this is what he said in his official address. Even if others do not demand much of you, you must demand much of yourselves. Even if others do not demand much from you, you must demand much from yourselves. It was the vision that he tried out with these young people long before he made it a kind of a theme of World Youth Day. I want to finish with this different moral vision. So that talk he gave first at Częstochowa, then he repeated at Westerplatte. So Westerplatte is in the north of Poland, not far from Gdansk. And it was one of the early battles of the Second World War. So Second World War breaks out. As you know, the Germans come from the west. The Russians come later that same month, September 1939, from the east. And one of the initial battles is at Westerplatte. And the Polish armed forces are totally outnumbered, but they fight and they hold out. They don't win, but they hold out longer than anybody thought that they could hold out. And it's a great heroic moment in the life of the Polish nation. And so at Westerplatte in 1987, John Paul says this: each one of you will find in your life a task you must assume and complete, some just cause in which it is impossible not to fight, some duty, some obligation from which you cannot escape and from which it is impossible to desert, a certain order of truths and values that you are obliged to maintain and defend. In such a moment, and there are many of them, for they are not something exceptional, remember, Christ is passing by you and saying, "Follow me." Do not abandon him, do not run away. Hear that call. So there, in a nutshell, is the pastoral approach of John Paul to young people and in general, and it's based on the truths of Veritatis Splendor. This is long before Veritatis Splendor was written. There is some order of truths that you are obliged to defend, and the Westerplatte example is one. They defended it and they all died. Not all of them, but they lost the battle. But they defended it, and he uses that same imagery, as it were, in part 3 of Veritatis Splendor when he uses the horizon of martyrdom to explain the Christian life. That is a pastoral approach, the Westerplatte approach, the heroic martyrdom approach, that lies behind Veritatis Splendor. The specifics of Veritatis Splendor deal with specific points of moral theology, but this is the general approach that's behind it. And the reason you don't find Veritatis Splendor really in Amoris Laetitia is because that pastoral approach has been set aside in favor of a different approach, which doesn't mean it's incorrect. But instead of the image of the battlefield, which is Westerplatte, you have the image of the field hospital. This is one that Pope Francis uses, the field hospital. Now, like most things in Catholic pastoral care, it's not just one is right and the other one's wrong. Both have something to offer. But in the field hospital, what do you have? You have people who are wounded who can't do anything for themselves. And as Pope Francis often says, it's actually foolish in the field, when you're treating someone who's wounded on the field of battle, to ask him questions about, what his blood sugars are like, or, his cholesterol level. It's not a time for heroic action. It's a time, basically, of passivity. Someone is wounded and needs to be treated. And there are people like that, obviously. But the field hospital is very different than the Westerplatte. Right? There are two different ways of presenting the life of the church or the life of discipleship. Two very different ways of being a pastor. Now, again, it's not that one is right and one is wrong. But the vision of Veritatis Splendor is very much the Westerplatte, obviously. The two things are in continuity. And that proposes for us an evangelical challenge. Is what pastoral approach is it that will be effective in making the encounter with the Lord Jesus, or proposing an encounter with the Lord Jesus? And that's another reason why Veritatis Splendor is not just a 25-year-old document, but very live in the life of the church today. The task of the new evangelization is sufficiently great that it's not going to be answered by one document or one approach. But I do think that the document, Veritatis Splendor, of 25 years ago, and its approach are essential for the challenge of the new evangelization today, and therefore, for those of you engaged in the work of theology at Newman, for those of you engaged in the work of priestly formation at the seminary, I recommend that you return, or for the first time, introduce yourself to the splendor of the truth. God bless you. Thank you.
Maybe if you could just raise your hand, I'll acknowledge you, and she'll come to you with the microphone. I'll start off. The question that I'd like to begin with is where you left with. Very helpfully, you described two different approaches, the Westerplatte and the field hospital approach. And you might say, somewhat sanguinely, you said to us that really these two visions can be reconciled, and I think that's plausible. But the question that comes to my mind is, what is it? What's the weakness about this text that those who don't like it, or those who might want to ignore it, are seeing? It's a fantastic piece of theological work. It takes 6 years or more to produce. And yet it's true, as you say. You began with this very this remarkable observation that in a more recent papal document, it's not even mentioned. So, anyways, could you reconstruct, you might say, the other side? So, what are the weaknesses that some people looking at this document might say, this is good, but you've really missed points 2, 3, and 4? Could you start us off with that?
Well, generally, you could say that Veritatis Splendor, which is why it ends with this third section on martyrdom, has a heroic approach to the life of discipleship. And the objection to the heroic approach to the life of discipleship is that the burdens of life, sometimes the consequence of our own sinfulness, but often not the consequence of my own actions, but the consequence of others that I have to suffer, is such that heroic action is not really possible, or if it's possible, only in a very limited circumstance. And therefore, what's happening is what Jesus would say in the Gospels, in a criticism of the Pharisees, that you lay heavy burdens on people and do not lift a finger to help them. Right? So that's why I said in pastoral theology, in pastoral work, it's never the case that it's only one option, and there may be people to whom the proposal of heroic discipleship would in fact be a bit cruel because of the circumstances of life have left them in a position where they can barely keep their head above water. And in fact, you are laying burdens on them and not lifting a finger, as Jesus chastised the Pharisees for doing. I mean, there's some very specific moral theories, and I don't want to really get into that because it's a bit complicated, but if you want to summarize, what is the conflict? That's the conflict, is what can you propose and what can people receive? And I don't believe that the field hospital image is a false image or a ridiculous image, because there are people who I think it describes very well. But that's not John Paul's principal image. It is Pope Francis' principal image. There's a difference there. When I say that maybe I was too sanguine, it's hard to reconcile them in an individual case because you can't do both at the same time. But what the question is, what is your starting point? Now, I'll just make one observation to get to the questions, is that I think that partly Pope John Paul took his approach to dealing with young people and extended it to everyone. And I think Pope Francis maybe agrees with John Paul on young people, because when he went to World Youth Day Krakow, he gave those homilies which were very challenging. He said, young people at 25 years old going into retirement, what's wrong with you? Don't sit around on the couch, get up and do something. In May of last year, he had a kind of, is the general audience, and he got on a tangent, but he was very animated. He said, live for something, don't just sort of get along. And he quoted Pier Giorgio's famous line that not to have a patrimony to defend, not to have some great cause to fight for is not living, it's mere existing. But I think that he thinks that might be suitable for a certain part, but the mass of humanity is more wounded, more suffering. So that might be one way to reconcile the two. But I think if you were to say, what might people say is the weakness of Veritatis Splendor, its moral theology and its pastoral theology, would be to say, well, you're defending a principle, but the principle demands something that most people cannot achieve. So you could counter that and say, well, then there's a lack of trust in God's grace, that my grace is not sufficient for you, contrary to St. Paul. But that would be the argument, and say, well, you're laying burdens on people and not helping them.
Thank you, Father Souza. To follow up on the question of Dr. Toppy, how do we, I guess what I'll say is, I I could see there could be a danger that you create a two-tiered structure within the church. You have Christian soldiers, and then you have Christian, bedridden fellows kind of down below. I guess is that what you're describing? But then, do you foresee any difficulties with having a two-tiered church where you have people who are trying to live lives of heroic virtue and then people who are stuck in a hospital? Could you maybe comment on that?
I suppose that could be a danger. From Calgary, by the way, excellent question. One of the key points of the Second Vatican Council was that there weren't different levels or the call to holiness was not just for a reserved few, and then the majority were not called to that. So what does it mean when you read those things in John Paul, the Westerplatte Address, or in Veritatis Splendor in Part 3? I think one way to reconcile that is that John Paul made a doctor of the Church, St. Therese of Lisieux, which in 1997, when he did that, it was a lot of people were, even who had a great devotion or admiration for St. Therese, were puzzled. He said there's nothing really remarkable about her theology. A very powerful spiritual biography that moved many, many people, probably more than anybody else in recent times. But theologically, she's not, she's no Albert the Great. So what is she doing as a doctor of the Church? And when John Paul did that and explained why he did that, it was because she made accessible to everyone, or to a very large number of people, a message of heroic sanctity, or sanctity in the heroism of ordinary things. And the other Teresa, of course, Teresa of Calcutta, famous for saying it's not that we do extraordinary things, but ordinary things with great love, which is actually a version of what Therese of Lisieux said. So that idea of heroic sanctity does not necessarily involve heroic acts, and in which case someone who is actually greatly suffering can achieve that level. That's, I think, how you try and reconcile those two things. But you're right, that the approach that the vision behind Veritatis Splendor, if, like anything, carried to an extreme or misapplied, would actually end up, even contrary to intention, in saying that holiness is for those who are capable of martyrdom and everybody else is somehow second rate, which is not the Christian tradition. So you're correct to point out that in any pastoral approach, you can always take it, if you misapply, take it too far, you lose your balance. And if you want to suggest how you keep your balance, if you were to read Veritatis Splendor, along with Scientia Divina Moris, the Science of Divine Love, which was the document of Therese's becoming a doctor of the Church, that might be a good compliment. There's one over there, over here, or perhaps not.
Thank you once again for your comments. I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about freedom's connection to the body. So you talk about freedom of indifference, freedom for excellence, and often freedom is conceived of as a transcendental or metaphysical reality, but humans as composite creatures. I wonder if you could speak a bit more about freedom's connection to the body, in particular in the context of a society where, bodily existence is not quite optional, but the body seems quite malleable. So I was just wondering if you could speak a bit more to that dynamic.
So the question about freedom and the body. So the body is part of our nature. It doesn't exhaust our nature, but we're bodily creatures. That's a very important part of our nature. And so if we respect our nature, the truth about our nature, that, you say, is that a limitation on our freedom? Well, at a very elementary level, my nature does not permit me to fly. So if I attempt to fly, I will come to grief. I don't have the freedom to eat however I want and also to have a certain level of health. The two things are related, right? And in our culture today, there's a lot of attention towards health, so it's actually a pretty good example to use with people, right? I can decide, I have the freedom to choose what I eat, but I can't eat sort of greasy, fatty foods and also have a very healthy heart. I can't. Just can't do it. So the body is part of that nature that has its own truths and has to be respected about it. So today we have, again, these two divergent tendencies. On one hand, you have a very careful attention to the truth of the body, right? So you have people who are very attentive to what I eat, how I sleep, even the air that I breathe, the air that other people, their emissions and so forth. A great deal of attention, right? For example, today, the things I did when I was a child, you can't do. Very dangerous things like bringing candy to school. Not allowed to bring sweets to school because it would corrupt the good eating habits of the other children. It's not allowed, right? So you think that's kind of okay. So the body, people are very respectful of the body. And then in other ways, as you intuit there, or imply rather, my body, I can change it. So if I decide that my body should be a different kind of body, then it should be, right? It doesn't have a nature, at least not a fixed or enduring nature. It has a malleable nature. So we see again these two tendencies. But you're correct, the bodily nature of the person that's, in some ways, that's where things really, and that's why on questions of sexuality, question end of life, beginning of life, all these things, these theories conflict because the body is, okay, that's where I really confront my nature. It's not the only part of my nature. Now, I just say as one last thing, actually, although the body is maybe the most tangible by definition part of our nature, people are far more neglectful of the spiritual dimension of our nature than our bodily nature. You'll find very few people arguing in favor of consuming things that we know are unhealthy for the body. They may still do it, but you wouldn't find people arguing in favor of it. But you find many people who will argue in favor of consuming things that are corrupting of the intellect, corrupting of the will, and corrupting of the soul.
Thanks again. I belong to the drinking reading group.
Is this your little baby here?
It is.
Very well behaved, I must say. Does she find theological lectures interesting?
She seems to. She was fairly quiet. I'm thinking, still trying to wrap my head around reconciling the Westerplatte pastoral approach and the field hospital approach. And going back to Humanae Vitae, where Paul VI actually says that this lifestyle of non-contraception in marriage is difficult, if not impossible, and you need frequent recourse to the sacraments. And so in Humanae Vitae, there's that call to this heroic, this Westerplatte approach. So in paragraph 75 of Veritatis, John Paul II is breaking down when you reference the consequentialist view, the I forget the other two, proportionalism, and the third one, the fundamental option. And so he basically says that those views lead to denying an objective moral evil. So I guess in trying to reconcile that, to me, that was an essential gauntlet throw against. If we look at Francis's field hospital approach, it seems like it falls into one of those teleological categories of consequentialism, proportionalism. How do you reconcile those two, unless we could say possibly that the field hospital approach is a means to the Westerplatte's end? It doesn't seem like a place you can stay without contradicting objective moral evil.
I'll start with the second part first. That's a good point, and many people have commented on the field hospital that if you just follow the logic of the field hospital, I mean, obviously the field hospital is not meant to be a permanent place. Right? By its very definition, it's temporary, it's urgent. You're dealing with the most wounded people, but the idea is that you have to get them out of the field hospital, and then you get them to a regular hospital, and then you get them into a rehab, which of course, is much more onerous and difficult than any, penance that would ever be prescribed to people, right? So my sister used to be a physiotherapist. She's in hospital management now, but we used to joke that the physiotherapists are the ones who come down onto the battlefield, find the wounded, and finish them off, right? So I think that the field hospital analogy or example, if you follow it through, it can't be an end. I mean, the point of a field hospital is not to remain there. So, but you could say it's a beginning point. So I think that's another way if you want to reconcile these two things. And, in a certain sense, maybe you have the Westerplatte approach, then you get injured, then you're in the field hospital, and you have to sort of, be restored. But you're right, I think that's a valid point. It points by its very nature to something beyond. As to the first part about humanae vitae and contraception, natural family planning, and so forth, one of the things that I think is lost is that many good things that come to us as gifts from God in a sinful world are received as burdens. I did a talk on humanae vitae about earlier this month in Toronto and I was asked to speak about the pastoral approach to these matters. And I consulted a lot of couples and I asked their testimonies on this. But a lot of things that are blessings in themselves are received in a sinful world as burdens. Life itself is burdensome, and we see that now with assisted suicide and voluntary euthanasia. People find life itself burdensome. But even leaving aside that, there are people who are actually living very heroic lives of discipleship, and you say, look, I'm ready to go, and why is the Lord waiting? Life is too difficult. It can be very beautiful, actually, but it's a burden. God's will, which is always good, we receive often as a burden. The things of the body, food, if I say, is food a blessing or a burden? What would you say? Depends how good a cook you are. Depends how much. Depends if you're Irish or if you're Indian. I won't comment which would be which. But food is a blessing. We enjoy eating. We need it for our nourishment. It's usually an occasion of friendship or family unity, et cetera, But think of all the effort that goes into shopping and cooking and preparation and cleaning up and so forth. You could say, well, actually, it seems burdensome. Families, think people who have to feed families. How much do they regard food as a blessing and how much as a burden? It can be very burdensome. Not to say people who have a difficulty. Maybe they struggle with overeating or being overweight and food is a burden for them principally. Or people who have certain allergies or digestive difficulty, whatever. So things that are blessings are often received as a burden. Children are a clear blessing, but they can be received as a burden. And you'd be foolish to tell someone, well, no, actually it's a joy of your life to get up at 3 a.m. to look after your child. It's both a blessing and a burden. And fertility, which is obviously related to that, is a blessing given to us, but also burdensome. And we shouldn't be surprised by that because that's what the Lord God says in Genesis, right? He says it, that things that are good for you, work, will now become toilsome. The relation between men and women, if you want to say romantic love, will become a situation of rivalry and domination. And childbearing specifically will become painful. So we're told that good things, 3 good things, will be burdensome in a fallen world. And I think we need to, in terms of moral vision, Sometimes, because we want to make persuasive arguments, we try to say something like, following the truth of the moral law will lead to pleasant outcomes. And that can be true, and I might even be bold enough to say it must be true in general. But in the specific circumstances for fallen human beings in a sinful world, it's possible it can be received as a burden, which is why St. Paul VI says what it is, that it's impossible or even difficult to live without recourse to God's grace.
At the risk of gnawing on this bone too much, I still struggle with this field hospital imagery. Because the way I see it applied a lot is that instead of just triage and giving people proper diagnosis for which you can get a prognosis, it's almost like it's a hospice, and where the best you can do is ease pain, welcome people, accompany them until they die of their illness. And it betrays, in a sense, almost a Lutheran anthropology or a Lutheran soteriology, right? That we are sinners until we die, and the best we can do is to know that we are forgiven, and we can't expect people to transcend their sin or their situation. And I don't suggest this is what the Holy Father meant, but it certainly is being taken that way by a lot of people in the church.
Well, it's interesting to think of the field hospital as a hospice. That's not the image he uses. He uses the field hospital. But I suppose if you want to use it as a hospice, that would be create other problems pastorally. I'll take your last point about Lutheranism. Actually, what happens in Lutheranism or Calvinism is quite the contrary, although I'm not saying you're incorrect in, if you want to say, the theological framework, but practically speaking, it becomes very demanding. It becomes very demanding because if I'm failing to live in conformity with the moral law, then there's real doubts about my salvation, even though theologically it shouldn't be so, but that's how it's actually lived, whereas in the more Catholic thinking, you have the degenerate whiskey priest who actually sort of muddles through and says, well, by God's grace, I'm going to make it. So I'm not sure if I'd say it has a Lutheran ethos to it. I know what you're saying, but I think in practice, that Lutheran approach can be its experience is a much more demanding or onerous approach.
If I may,
Gnawing on the bone yet again. I said, are you gnawing on the bone once again?
I'm a former Lutheran pastor.
Ah,
I'm very familiar with Lutheran theology.
more than I am, I would say. Now you should. Now that's the kind of thing you might, what they call full disclosure in journalism today. Just slide that in at the end. Okay, all right. So, Pastor, what do you got for us?
That may be true of Calvinism, but
Okay.
it isn't true of Lutheranism, because in Lutheran theology, it's justus et peccator. You're at the same time a sinner
Right.
and you don't really have to worry about, if you're baptized, you're in
Okay, I understand I see what you're emphasizing.
my concern.
Yes, well, I mean, Luther wasn't wrong about everything, obviously, and we are both justus et peccator at the same time. But yes, I can understand what you're saying there. If the idea is that God's grace is sufficient, that I need not worry about my conformity with it, yes, that would be if that's the problem. But yeah, okay, thank you for that clarification. Anybody else who has a exotic background that they're not going to tell me about before they answer? What were you before?
Yeah, just to be clear. Father de Souza, you mentioned that
for the most part, people are all right with looking at the nature of things to figure out morality. And you mentioned the nature of language for lying and the nature of the environment. Except when it comes to life and sexual ethics. And I want to know, why do you think that is the case, and how can we respond? I think the go-to answer is just because the church's teaching here is difficult, but that doesn't quite seem to fit the bill, because honesty is difficult as well, and so is treating the environment with respect. So why are these two issues such a battleground today, and how can we react to it?
It's a good question. I often tell my students that in every age, the church is out of sorts with the culture on some issue. So if you go back to the 17th century, you may not have found many disputes on sexual morality, but on other issues. Because no culture is ever fully in accord with the gospel. Every culture needs purification by the gospel, and therefore in every age there's some aspect of the gospel that brings the church into conflict with the surrounding culture. Oftentimes in church history, that issue was the church refusing to concede that the civil ruler had unlimited power. That's one of the things that often crops up in church history, but in every age. But why is our age today the question of things to do with sexuality, with the body, with marriage, with children, with life itself? I think I would say that it's to do with both the practical application of technology and the ethos of technology. The technology gives us the sense that we can master the physical world, and in many ways we have mastered the physical world. And so if I can get on a plane in Toronto and Kingston and be in Alberta the same day, and I get off the plane and I go to a restaurant and I should be able to pay for something with the same plastic card I use in Kingston. If I can't do that, I think something's wrong with the world. Then to tell me, okay, you have to respect the order written into your body. Say, well, I don't respect the order written into my body, because now I can pay for something in Edmonton that my money is in Kingston, but maybe it's not even in Kingston. Who knows where it is? So there's this, Pope Francis uses this term that he takes from Romano Guardini called the Technocratic Paradigm, where he adapts it from Romano Guardini, that it's a way of thinking about the world. And our bodies are part of that world. And if we can master the physical world around us, why is it that I cannot manipulate or master my body? Why do I have to respect certain things about it? And that's a clash. It's not an easy thing to explain why up until this point. And then when you talk about certain medical advances, so it's good that I can put something into my heart to regulate its beating, but it's bad that I put something in my body to regulate its fertility. Right? I mean, there's an argument you can be made there, but you see why it becomes a bit more complicated. So technology, the fact that we live in a technological age, it affects not just the way we live, but it affects what we can do. It affects how we think. And it affects how we think about our bodies, right? And now we live in an age where my bodiliness is consistently de-emphasized, right? So virtual reality, the fact that I can communicate with someone in another part of the world, that started with telephones and so forth, but still it's exacerbated or accelerated. Maybe I'll finish with this here, because it's actually a much more fundamental question than morality. Marshall McLuhan, who was a Catholic convert, very famous for his few quips about the media, but Marshall McLuhan's fundamental worry about religion in a technological electronic age was he says the electronic age is, he said, fundamentally anti-sacramental. Because what is a sacrament? A sacrament takes something that's intangible, God, grace, and makes it tangible, right? So you have the risen Jesus, who at least in some ways is intangible. He also has a body and makes it present on the altar. Or you have grace conveyed through tangible things. So McLuhan said, well, what do electronic communications do? And he's talking then about radios and television. The digital world of the internet was obviously in the future, although he seemed to have anticipated it. He says it's anti-sacramental because it takes a tangible thing and makes it less tangible. So how can I speak to someone on the other side of the country? Well, my body prevents me from speaking to someone in Vancouver because my body's here and he's in Vancouver, so we cannot speak to each other. But we have this mechanism which takes my tangible body and reduces it to its voice, which reduces it into analog signals, now digital signals, and ships them somewhere else and then reproduces them. So what's tangible becomes less tangible so it can be communicated. That's basically McLuhan in 30 seconds. And he says that's anti-sacramental. Doesn't mean it's not useful. Actually, it's very useful. But it's anti-sacramental. And he said the church is sacramental, the gospel is sacramental, and to propose the gospel, which is sacramental in an anti-sacramental age, is not possible. That was his worry. Because you can't fix that. You can't say that a sacramental intuition about reality can be conveyed in an anti-sacramental way in its fullness. The two things are contradictory. Now, that doesn't mean the gospel cannot be preached. Doesn't mean grace cannot work. With God, all things are possible. But McLuhan was talking about something that's very fundamental, where the culture, not one particular strain of thinking, but the entire ethos is contrary to the gospel, he's suggesting. And we see it when it comes to the body, which is why I think that's the area of greatest conflict. But it's something that invites very profound thinking about the ethos around us, this technological electronic age, and how to present A, sacramental gospel, B, the church, universal sacrament of salvation, and C, or maybe even A, better to say, the Lord Jesus himself, who is the sacrament of the Father. Is that enough, Ryan?
Is it possible to just do 2 more questions? There's 2 people.
With God, all things are possible, but not with me. Go ahead.
Hi, Father.
Hello.
I'm speaking to you, I suppose, from the heart of a mother, not necessarily a theologian. You spoke at the beginning of this perception that's generally out there, and I would agree with that, that on a general note, the church is largely perceived as a bearer, a body of moral rules to follow, and formulas. And John Paul II, in Novum Millennium Inuente, and I believe also he repeated it in his letter on the Rosary, said that we will not be saved by a formula, but by a person. And when we encounter a person and we fall in love with that person, we're capable of very heroic things. Ask parents. I know that to be very true. So it seems to me that if we want to bring people to moral excellence, we have to start with a place of encounter with Christ. Does that make sense? Is my logic clear there? And so the question is, even amongst young Catholics who feel that they've been in the church for years and have not really had an encounter with Christ, where do we begin to address that question?
Well, it's not just a question for a mother's heart. It's a very important question for the church in general, but pastors as well. At the recent Synod for Youth, Cardinal Mark Ouellette, a Canadian, former rector of St. Joseph's Seminary, so what Father Stephen is, he once was, And he said something extraordinary. He said in his testimony or intervention at the synod, he said that he was in the seminary before he knew the person of Jesus Christ. He did not have an encounter with Jesus Christ until he was already in the seminary for several years. So how did he get into the seminary? Well, he got into the seminary because the culture around him floated people like him into the seminary, right? And if he lived in a different culture, he wouldn't have been in the seminary. So that's the importance of a Christian culture, because it's not easy to have an encounter with the Lord. And so in this case, this man who's devoted his life to the church and in very esteemed and admirable ways was not, as he was kind of saying, he was not a Christian. He lived a Christian life, an admirable one, but he was not a Christian. So how do you become a Christian? That's with an encounter with the Lord Jesus. How do you do that? In my work, which is mostly with young people on campus, the method that is used is personal witness, personal testimony, and invitation, which is not a mass program and it's not a mass movement, so you can criticize it for that. On the other hand, you could say it's the way that Jesus and the apostle did it, at the beginning anyway. So that's that question of the encounter, and in Veritatis Splendor you find a lot of meditation on that encounter, that the rich young man came to Jesus with a question. So we have to bring people there. How do we do it? Well, you can invite people. Now, just because you invite someone to come doesn't mean they'll have an encounter. That's a mystery. That is, in the end, a mystery of the Lord's grace and the Lord's providence. But it does tell us the importance of that environment that we create, right? If Marc Ouellette was growing up he grew up in Amos, Quebec, in northern Quebec, today he would not be in the seminary, right? He probably wouldn't even be going to Mass. Right? But he grew up when he did, and he ended up as a priest, even though he wasn't a Christian, in a real sense, until quite far along the way. Quite an extraordinary testimony, right? But that's the importance of that environment. It's the importance of invitation. It's the importance of encouragement. But in the end, when that happens, is a mystery of the Lord's grace. Which is why, if you want to talk about a mother's heart, that's why in a family where children are all raised more or less the same way, some meet the Lord and some don't, even though nothing was really different one to the other. So the best we can do is we can share our witness, we can share our testimony even. We have to be bold to think that we can do it, we have something to offer. But how it will be received, we can't control that. But you're right, the encounter with the Lord has to come. Now, it doesn't always come at the beginning, sometimes it comes later, but it does have to come at some point.
Where's the last question?
My question is similar to what she has asked you. I quite enjoy your statement that the church should be moving from legalism to love. But is the church resistant to such a move on? This is what I'm interested in. I see the importance of the movement from legalism to love, compassion, and as Pope Francis has said, mercy, because I think we are losing a lot of our young people. They don't understand the rigidity with which the church, I hate to use the word rules, but lack of a better word, I guess I have to say that, and we are losing that. My experience with young people has been 30 years in the classroom and talking to them about faith and church and so on. They don't see it as a meaningful institution where there's love and so on. And the lady who spoke before me said the same thing. So is there resistance to some change from legalism to love within the church?
Well, I think the answer to that is yes, because legalism is easier than love. Love is more difficult. So even, for example, in a family, which is our best example, the church is more like a family than a society or a corporation. But rules are, you can sort of make a family work by just insisting on the rules. And you can even get people to sort of agree to them. But it's also possible that same family that could work may not have love in it. And so at the moment when the rules are lifted, everybody wants to get out of there, right? So the family is not really working. So I think legalism, the rules are easier. So is there resistance? I think probably at the level of principle, probably not. If you ask someone, but especially if you put it that way, do you prefer legalism or do you prefer love? You're not going to get a lot of people on the legalism side. But the idea of creating a loving encounter, both in the church and between the church and her Lord, is more difficult. That phrasing was actually not mine. It's Archbishop Chaput. I don't disagree with it. I introduced it for that reason. But what he illustrates there is that this can fall on both sides. That we give people only the rules and say, just follow the rules and you'll be okay. But there's no encounter that would keep you there if you don't have to obey the rules. And if everybody has to obey the rules, you kind of go along with it. So it's possible to say, even in times when there was much more, if you want to say, visible observance, you could say maybe there was not as much love present. It's hard to judge those things. But another way to get away from the loving encounter with the Lord is to say, well, there's no challenge here. As you are is as you will be, and you cannot be different. So I think you're correct on that. And the resistance would come actually from, if Archbishop Chaput is correct, from different directions, But I would say that well, if you've been a school teacher, what grade do you teach?
11.
Oh, it's a high school student. Well, at that age, you would know better than I would, but really to have an impact on the students. A good teacher can run a good classroom. A good teacher can provide good guidance. But the teacher who's going to make a great impact on the life of the students is the teacher who's willing to give of herself something more. It might be the amount of time she spends with them. It might be the willingness she is to allow them into her life or vice versa. And that's harder than just, I'm not saying it's a small thing, but just running a good classroom. So if you ask, is there resistance? Probably not on the level of principle, but someone might say, that's too much. I'll just do something less. So I think that's how it answers it. Yes, there is resistance there. Not when you formulate it in those stark ways I formulated, no one's going to argue that. But it's harder. It's harder. And to offer someone rules that are good, and that that are good, is one thing. To show them, to really love them, and to go further is a much more demanding thing. And that's likely, the point that you made about Pope Francis, that's what I think his emphasis is on that. So it's a good thing that we should be heedful of, and I think it's a good question to end with. Thank you.